Hi, I'm Rachel Dwosk, and I teach fiction in the program on creative writing. Thank you guys very much for coming to the Dedmon lecture tonight. The Claire and Emmett Dedmon Visiting Writers program was generously created with support from Jonathan Dedmon, who we're very happy to have with us here tonight. Jonathan is a member of the Humanities Visiting Committee, and this annual program is in honor of his parents, Claire and Emmett Dedmon. Tonight, we are thrilled to have Ted Conover as this year's Dedmon Writer-in-Residence. In the preface to a recent reprint of Ted Conover's first book, Rolling Nowhere, Riding the Rails with America's Hobos, which he wrote when he was 24, Ted Conover writes, "The wondrous thing about hobos who were spawned by the Great Depression has always been the way we created something romantic out of the inevitable. Freedom of choice, the idea that I'd live this way even if I didn't have to, is an essential part of the notion and reason I wanted to live that life myself." That's what Conover does in his work. He lives the lives he's writing. Rolling Nowhere was his master's thesis, a project he lived by riding the rails to their furthest reaches and along the way chronicling the experiences and aspirations of a community of human beings to whose stories we would never otherwise have had access. Some of the people he met in those years would be the stars of his next book, Coyotes, for which Conover joined Mexican migrants trying to find better lives for themselves and hope for their families across the border of America. Conover's a researcher not just of marginalized individuals or subcultures, but of the human condition, of what we share across differences that might seem to divide or define us. And he's not simply an immersion journalist willing to live for years in unimaginably unfamiliar and difficult situations. He's an empathetic listener and writer of the first order, someone who takes on literally the task of imagining absolutely and fully the experience of another human being, which is, I think, the ultimate goal of masterful writing. Conover was a guard at Sing Sing while writing his book New Jack. He risked his own health and safety so he could expose the realities of the lives of prisoners there. He reported on Guantanamo Bay, the 6.8-inch by 8-foot wide metal cells built from shipping containers in which human beings were made to remain 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with 20-minute breaks twice a week for exercise. In his book The Roots of Man, he drove the world's highways, asking what we build for each other and ourselves, and how small or big the world actually is. For Whiteout, Conover became a taxi driver for the Mellow Yellow Cab Company in Aspen, encountering scenes and stories of unimaginable wealth and celebrity, and then working as a journalist for the Aspen Times, where he considered deeply the life of the town and his own position in it. In all of his work, Conover is starkly unpretentious, often very funny, always thoughtful. His empathy is immersive, and he's patient, measured, lucid in his approach and prose, meticulous in the detail with which he renders the lives of the people whose stories he tells, including his own. In 2014, Ted Conover rode the rails again, this time with his son, then 18-year-old Asa, who had read Rolling Nowhere and wanted to see something of his father's early adventure. Conover wrote a piece for Outside Magazine on hopping illegally aboard trains once he was a father. And the article is full of both the full-on empathy of all of his writing, finely layered with parental caution, and even, I think, some wonder at the risks he himself has taken in his life and work. In the article, when Conover confesses to his son that he's fearful that Asa will get hurt, Asa rests his head on Conover's arm, a moment Conover describes. Then he put his arm around my shoulder. I put my arm around him, looked straight at the back of the grainer rumbling in front of us in the dark, tried not to cry. Wished the moment would last and last. It was one of the nicest things ever. How much credit can we take when a kid turns out well? In this case, I'm going with a lot of credit, for good, thoughtful work in the world, for the kind of careful listening to other people's stories that makes Ted Conover not only an astonishing writer, but probably also a brilliant parent, and one of the best teachers I've ever seen teach. I personally learned an incalculable amount about teaching from Ted Conover, and also about taking a kaleidoscopic view of the world and how to engage in it. And I'm not the only person. Ted's written 6 books, including one on writing, which you should all pick up and study immediately, Immersion, A Writer's Guide to Going Deep. He's the author of New Jack, Guarding Sing Sing, an account of 10 months he spent working as a corrections officer at New York's Sing Sing prison, for which he won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer. He's also the author of Rolling Nowhere, Coyotes, Whiteout, Lost in Aspen, and The Roots of Man, Travels in the Paved World. He graduated from Amherst College, spent 2 years at Cambridge as a Marshall Scholar, and has an honorary doctorate from Amherst and a Guggenheim. He contributes to publications including the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, Harper's, Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and others, and he teaches at New York University. We are lucky to have him here at the University of Chicago tonight and grateful. Please join me in welcoming Ted Conover.
I can never live up to that introduction. Let me just start right now and admit it. That's beyond. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. Thanks to my friends here who must have put in a good word to invite me. Thanks to Jonathan Dedmon for providing the occasion for it. And I should notice, as I was doing my diligence before coming here today, that you were a reporter at the Rocky Mountain News when I was delivering the Rocky Mountain News from my bicycle. I know it was a great newspaper in Denver. It's gone now, but remembered. Among creative writing genres, the hallmark of journalism is documentary research. Facts, in my view, are facts, but the processes involved in learning them and then in rendering them as writing are in their essence creative. So I think you can be creative in how you research something, and it makes a big difference to what you're able to write. Doing journalism used to mean avoiding the first person unless you were a columnist, but for complicated reasons that has changed and continues to change. One reason is the collapse of print advertising and the old network, big newspaper models. Another is the decreased barriers to publication brought on by the internet, which is obviously very connected. Anybody can publish now, and many do and speak in their own voice. I was lucky to have preferred the first person from early on. It felt like the most natural way for me to write. I discovered the way I could write. In college, I came upon the new journalism, Hunter Thompson, Joan Didion, Tom Wolfe, and upon travel writing, Bruce Chatwin left a big impression with me, with his deeply engaged but restrained first person, attentive to myth and tone. A story was the other thing that made sense to me, characters and tension and a sequence of events. And then, as Rachel mentioned, in college I discovered anthropology and became interested in ethnography and the ways it could deepen journalism, and started thinking about privileging story over exposition. So my most recent book, Immersion, is, yes, from the University of Chicago Press. And in it I talk about the immersive approach to research, which seems to have become the thing I'm best known for. Tonight I'll read a passage from the beginning of that and follow it with what I guess amounts to a sampler. 3 short passages from other books, and I have to decide about this, Rachel. I was going to finish with the article you quoted, thank God, at the end of your introduction, because I've always had trouble reading it and not getting emotional. So you saved me from that. I'm not going to reread that part, but I might read a different part. The epigraph to Immersion is a line from David Bowie, his song Changes, turn and face the strange. I'd heard that song 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times growing up, and never knew the first line of the refrain until I read his obituary, turn and face the strange. For me, it started on a train. I hopped it in the old Missouri Pacific Yard in St. Louis. I was 22 years old and had little idea what I was doing. In the movies, hobos always boarded trains that were moving, and so that was my plan. Sit in the weeds, out of sight, and wait for a train going slowly enough that I might grab a hold and climb aboard. It took me more than a day to catch that train. The victory of my first freight hop into an open-topped gondola car became a defeat about 10 minutes later when the string of cars was parked at a siding just outside the yard. But then another came by, and finally I hopped a real freight. Westbound, as luck would have it. By that point I would have departed in any direction. To me, the ride was like a prelude, a passage into another country. When 2 days after that I finally met up with a hobo and began to travel with him, I felt my journey had truly begun. I had no idea at the time that I would one day write a book about my experience. Nobody I had met in my life, to my knowledge, outside of professors, had written a book. But I did have a plan to write about it, first in the form of diary-like field notes, and then, if my professors thought I had enough material, in the form of an undergraduate anthropology thesis. As it turned out, few of my friends were as interested in that thesis, which considered matters such as hobo perceptions of time and space, as they were by stories of my experience. Were you ever scared? Did you ever get arrested? Who were the people you traveled with? I wrote an article for a student magazine about one morning with a hobo in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. The college alumni magazine reprinted it, and the national media started calling. To make a long story short, I was able to get a book contract, essentially to rewrite my thesis in narrative form as a chronological story with characters and incidents. That became Rolling Nowhere. Over the years, I've returned to immersive projects like Riding the Rails again and again. One reason is that I like to learn via experience, to imagine a situation that will teach me something. I find exploring social worlds to be rewarding. With different parents in a different place or time, my life would have been so different. Could I have managed, I've often wondered, to live in that way or that? What's life like for those people? How to think about strangers is one of the conundrums of human existence. The warning parents give children, don't speak to strangers, may be good advice when it comes to unknown adults. But how about other kids? What's school for most of us other than a first experience of immersion among contemporaries we don't know? And when does it become okay to speak to strangers? Ever? Many of us are nervous around others. We're slow to put ourselves out there, wary of entanglements or rejection. We hang out with our own kind. Shyness is natural, but not necessarily a good thing. If we can't get past it, our worlds can stay small. My third grade teacher, whom I loved, tried to get us to think about shyness. She quoted Will Rogers, the American humorist and homespun philosopher. I never met a man I didn't like. Wow, really, I thought? Even bad people? Bank robbers? Murderers? I've been thinking about that idea for almost 50 years. When I walked downtown on Broadway in New York, to which Whitman addressed a poem, what hurrying human tides, or day or night, what passions, winnings, losses, ardors, swim thy waters, I try to channel him because in some ways Whitman helps me to understand myself. I like to travel and I like to hang out, and Whitman helps me understand why. Whitman, as many Americans still do, nurtured an idea of a country where nobody's better than anybody else, where everyone can meet and engage. It strikes me as an ideal worth keeping alive. When I'm out there talking to people, I feel as though I'm emulating, maybe even modeling, a kind of democratic discourse. Of course, Americans don't have a corner on this kind of thinking. An expression in Spanish conveys a related idea, cada cabeza es un mundo. Every mind is a world, a universe. In other words, each of us is interesting. What could be a better calling in this world than getting to know other minds? While hopping freights, I several times came upon Mexican migrants doing the same thing. The American-born hobos I was with tended to be scornful of the Mexicans, but it occurred to me that in a certain way, they were the true modern-day inheritors of the American tramp tradition, immigrants traveling to work. The more I thought about it, the more I concluded that travel with Mexican migrants should be my next project. Late summer of 1985 found me in the central Mexican state of Querétaro, trying to learn about what, from the locals' point of view, was emigration to my country. My host, a farmer, had traveled to the States in the 60s to make money in the fields, the early part of a wave that expanded into the current century. Many, even most of the men in the area, and growing numbers of women, had done the same thing. He heard me ask them about how they'd managed the trip across the border, what it was like, had seen me fill notebooks with their replies. I'd told him about my hobo project, and one day, as we left the house of his neighbor, he seemed to be tired of hearing me ask the same old questions. I think he knew that I, afraid of the logical next step, was stalling. "It's better to see once than to listen many times," he said finally. For him, the do-it-yourself step was familiar, something nervous-making to be sure, a thing of gravity, but nothing that half of his contemporaries hadn't themselves done already. For me, it was unfamiliar, and from my point of view, risky in ways that his passage was not. My complexion would make me stand out. I would attract attention. Asking questions, I said to myself, was helping me to prepare. But he'd had enough. "Quit asking about it," he said in so many words, "and just do it. Cross the border yourself. Vaya, go." That's good advice. I'm going to read a very short passage from Rolling Nowhere. The boxcar on the freight from McCook, Nebraska rocked from side to side as the train slowed and crossed a section of bad track on its arrival into Denver. Brakes squealed and doors banged, every sound magnified by the huge echo chamber that's an empty boxcar. My fellow passenger had not spoken during most of the trip, which was okay since I probably couldn't have heard him anyway. But now as we entered the yards, he started to talk. "Goddamn coal trains," he muttered, surveying the ones we'd have to climb over to make our way out of the yard. I stood in the open doorway of the boxcar, surveying the Denver night. "Hey, get back," he hissed, pointing to the railroad control tower we were about to pass. "They'll put the dicks on us." Nobody says that anymore. I retreated to the darkness at the back of the car. "They got a mission here?" I asked him, wondering where I'd spend the night. 23rd and Lawrence," he said with little pleasure, "but it's too late to check in. You missed the sermon. Hell, you missed dinner too, but that's okay. All they serve is some goddamn beans somebody made 50 years ago up in Laramie. What I do, I sleep in one of them bad order cars they got lined up on the UP tracks down there. They don't move them to the shop till morning." I nodded, adding that I was unfamiliar with the routine in Denver. "Oh, it's a good town for eating," he said. "You got the Sally at 21st and Larimer at 9 a.m., bologna sandwiches at the Holy Ghost Church at 10, dinner at the Catholic Worker at 4. He went on. A Denver native, I'd never heard of these places. The train stopped with a jerk that nearly knocked us off our feet. I was cautioned to wait until they broke the air, the signal that the locomotives had disconnected themselves and the train was going no farther. Finally came the whoosh. My companion signaled me to follow, and stealthily we climbed down from the boxcar and wound our way over the coal trains and out of the yard, entering downtown just north of Union Station. Home looked foreign from this angle. "My name's Ted," I started. He kept walking. "Well, Ted, one thing you got to know about Denver. If you got 2 pennies in your pocket, separate them. I'll probably see you tomorrow." And he turned bedroll over his shoulder and vanished down Larimer Street. So let me move ahead in time, and you may see a writer getting a little older and hopefully a little better. This is from an article for the New Yorker I wrote called "The Road is Very Unfair, Trucking Across Africa in the Age of AIDS." My college roommates had both gotten AIDS shortly after graduation, and I wanted to write about the epidemic, which at that point in time was very new. People still didn't really know how it spread. Haitians and intravenous drug users, along with gay men, seemed to be the ones who suffered the most. But there were signs that in other countries that straight guys got this. And in fact, straight men with a lot of mobility, such as truck drivers in India and in Africa, were identified as likely carriers. And I'd been thinking, how could I write about this in a way that Americans would care about? And Americans, especially back in the 80s and 90s, there's this vogue in sort of truck driver culture, CB radios and all that. And so I thought, if I pitched this as a sort of East African version of our trucker culture, maybe they'd go for it. And it still strikes me as a miracle that they did, just on the basis of a letter I sent to the editor of The New Yorker, who was, before it came out, fired and replaced by Tina Brown. But that's another story. The red dirt is so slick with rain that the trucks stacked along either side look as if they might simply have slid off. Pools of muddy water fill the center. All 30 or 40 trucks are pointed one way, toward the border crossing a few hundred yards down the road, towards Tanzania. Most have come to this place, a Kenyan settlement called Isebania, from Mombasa, where there's a port, or from Nairobi, where there's an oil depot. The weekend has stopped their progress. The customs offices are closed. There's no traffic except for the back and forth of turnboys attending to a group of 4 semi-rigs with royal blue tractors hooked up to long white shipping containers. The trucks have punctures, as they say in East Africa, and the turnboys must repair them. And when that's done, there are mechanical problems which the turnboys must attend to as well. The 4 drivers of this small convoy sip tea under the narrow wooden awning of one of the many one-room restaurants that line the road and watch the muddy proceedings. One of the perquisites of being a driver is that the driver gets to stay clean. Each driver's turnboy is responsible for their particular truck. He maintains it mechanically, guards it at night, warms it up in the morning. In colonial days, he turned the crank that started the motor, hence turnboy. And he even does the cooking if there's no restaurant around. The turnboys with their trucks are like Maasai with their cattle, constantly attentive. When the trucks are in a group like this, the turnboys help each other out. On my left, Malek, the driver of the truck called Fleet 10, yells to his turnboy, Stephen, to be sure to check the tubes for more than one puncture each. Malek then explains to me that these flats could have been avoided if the armed escort traveling with his truck from Nairobi had allowed them all to rest. Escorts provided by the National Traffic Police are required for any truck hauling valuable imported goods, electronics, for example, or tires, as in the case of Fleet 10. This is because of the likelihood of theft or ambush, even in a country with the stability of Kenya. The convoys of escorted trucks, up to 30 or 40 of them, tend to travel at night when the traffic is light, typically setting off around 2 or 3 a.m. But the traffic police, in a hurry to arrive, sometimes push the drivers too hard. A driver like Francis, whose jumbo rig, Fleet 37, is 72 feet long, with a payload of 3 containers weighing 100 tons, needs to go quite slowly or else make frequent stops to let his brakes and tires cool off in hilly central Kenya. But on this trip, the policeman had insisted that he keep going. The result was several burst tires. I did not arrive with the 3 trucks in the escorted convoy, but instead joined them in a 4th truck, Fleet 19, which was carrying empty beer bottles. Such a load, Malik explains, does not qualify as protected cargo. It is unlike auto parts, imported liquor, or clothes from your dead people. What? I ask. Yes, you know, the clothes they sell at markets, he says. But what dead people? You know, the clothes they sell that have been worn by your people who now are dead. Nguo za mitumba. It suddenly dawns on me. Second-hand clothes. Yes. I see that Malek, though he's a worldly man who's traveled on 3 continents, does not understand the discarding of clothes that can still be worn. In other words, he does not understand the Western practice of fashion. I don't have the heart to explain it. I revisit 2 of these drivers in my book, The Roots of Man. When I was researching that about 8 years ago, they were still at it. The son of Malik friended me on Facebook about 4 years ago, and last year told me he had died. But Facebook is an amazing thing for me because these people I wrote about keep finding me in a way that is kind of fantastic. The most recent is the sole woman to travel with a group of 17 guys from Querétaro across the border into Arizona, from which most of us went up to Idaho. She had eloped with a guy who was the leader, who did not always treat her well over the next year. She's back in Mexico. She has kids. One of them's in a Wapango music group and wants to make a CD, and she's looking for donations, and I just sent $100. I love that stuff. I love when people find me. I'm going to read from Rolling Nowhere. Again, not Rolling Nowhere, New Jack. I became a New York State Corrections officer. Well, it started with a New Yorker assignment that I couldn't do. I wanted to write about a whole family of corrections officers upstate. There's whole families. There's aunts and uncles and kids who live in little towns where prisons are a relatively good job in terms of pay and benefits. They're bad in all kinds of other ways, but I wanted to write about a town like that, and the state basically wouldn't let me go to work with someone I wanted to write about. I could visit a prison with an official tour, but they said I couldn't watch what somebody did on the job. And I thought, this is the second largest employer in New York after Verizon, is the corrections. Second largest employer. $2.8 billion budget a year, and they act like it's the CIA. And so I felt justified in applying for a job and not telling them I was going to do that. I talked to a couple of lawyers who said, just don't lie. Don't lie. You don't have to tell them everything, but just don't tell them anything that's not true. And that's really good advice if you ever do something like this. I later met a reporter for the New York Times who had gotten a job in a slaughterhouse, and he on his employment form, it asked him for all previous job experience, and he wrote there in that box, he wrote yes, and got the job. So that wasn't a lie. Anyway, it took me 3 years to get hired. I spent 2 months in the training academy in Albany, and then on a Friday, I learned I'd need to report to Sing Sing prison on a Monday. And I was glad, because it's only 40 minutes from where I live, and I could have been sent 6 hours from where I live. And we had just had our second child, who was like 3 months old, and I don't think I would have written the book if I had had to go to Attica. Anyway, here's about a prisoner I met. Larson's cell decor reflected his difference. Like so many other inmates, he had a dozen or so girly pinups on his wall, but his were conspicuously clothed. And they weren't white, but African American like him. He had a pile of cassette tapes, mostly hip-hop, but he had a much taller stack of books. His Dictionary of Evolution, he told me, he'd bought from another inmate for a pack of cigarettes. There were volumes of Afrocentric history like the ones that are sold on the sidewalk in downtown Brooklyn, social science primers, and an academic survey of perceptions of race over the years. I'd stopped at his cell after he knew me a little and asked what he was reading. Here, he said, passing the book through the bars, read this page. The book was an old work of physical anthropology, and the passage was about the classification of Homo sapiens into different racial strains. Oh yeah, I said, they used to worry about this stuff a lot. Who? Anthropologists. Larson stared at me. What's your story, Conover? He asked a moment later. You're not like the other COs here. What do you mean? You mean because I'm not from upstate? No, it's something else, the way you think and the way you walk. My heart rate rose a bit. Except for Dieter, my bunkmate, back at the academy, my passage through the Department of Correctional Services had been blissfully free of anyone, officer or inmate, with the slightest interest about my background. Prisons were full of people who liked to talk more than they liked to listen, and lack of curiosity had been my friend. But Larson was smart and uncannily observant. I've got to just tell you a quick story here that's not in the book. I went to a fancy wedding one night after about 9 months at the prison, I brought a suit, put it in my locker, which was far from the prison gate, and changed into it right after work. Didn't get home until 3 in the morning, had to get up at 5 a.m. to go back to work. And as I'm walking down the tier in front of Larson, he had his mirror out, and when I got even with the cell, he said, "Hey, Conover." I'm like, "Yeah?" He goes, "How come you're walking like you should be wearing a tuxedo this morning?" Anyway, you went to college, he asked. Yeah, I wasn't going to lie. And what did you study? Anthropology. Anthropology? That's a hard and deep subject, man. He stared at the wall for a moment. What are you doing here? You should be a teacher or something. I paused and swallowed. It was my feeling exactly, and I wanted to tell him so. Instead, I evaded by saying, "Life takes funny turns, Larson. You probably know something about that. How'd you end up here?" It was his third bid, he said, after doing time for assault in Alabama, where he grew up, and a second sentence for weapons possession. He'd been in New York, dating a woman who was also dating a CO. He and the man had gotten into an argument in the lobby of her building. The CO had drawn his gun, but Larson had shot him first, too many times, he said, and had been sent back to prison with a sentence of 8 years to life. Conover, when I came into prison the first time, I couldn't read or write. Apart from prison literacy courses, he said, he was entirely self-educated. Instead of wasting so much of the inmates' time on rec, Larson thought, Sing Sing should put a small library on every gallery so that inmates could sit in their cells and read. Again, I'm just going to skip ahead. He passed me a couple of dog-eared photocopies from radical journals that decried the huge social resources being devoted to imprisonment. $35 billion a year in the United States and growing despite the drop in violent crime. You could feel the rush of prison growth even in the forgotten backwater of Sing Sing, where the superintendent had said that getting money to build new and bigger vocational shops was his #1 priority. "I'd die to stop that," Larson said, to my surprise. "You don't want to see this place improve?" "No. The money should be put back into poor neighborhoods, back into education for children, to change the things that send people here." He held out the articles he'd loaned me. "You read these, right?" I nodded. "Then tell me, Conover, if I understand correctly. It says here in this article that the government's planning right now for the new prisons they're going to need in 10 or 12 years. I got that right?" Again, I nodded. "That's wrong." "What's wrong about planning ahead?" "Because dig this. Anyone planning a prison they're not going to build for 10 or 15 years is planning for a child, planning prison for somebody who's a child right now. So you see, they've already given up on that child. They already expect that child to fail. You heard? Now why, if you could keep that from happening, if you could send that child to a good school and help his family stay together, if you could do that, why are you spending that money to put him in jail?" I had no answer for Larson. He'd made me feel dumb in my uniform, like a bozo carrying out someone else's ill-conceived plan. But he didn't act as if I were to blame. "Hey," he said, by way of goodbye, "next time you're back, send me a couple of theories to talk about." So 4 years ago, I got a friend request from Larson on Facebook, and we ended up having lunch in the city, and he's still hungry for education. He asked if he could come to some of my classes, and he ended up coming to 4 during the semester. Everybody wanted to interview him, but we made it manageable. And anyway, he's doing well. Okay, so in 1984, when I published Rolling Nowhere, America had more than a dozen freight railroads instead of just 7. Ronald Reagan was trying to bring down the Soviet Union. Trains still had cabooses, and I was single and didn't have a son and a daughter. By 1994, the year my wife Margot gave birth to Asa, all that had changed. And something else happened on that day. I began to worry. Mostly I worried in the way that all parents worry, but in addition I began to worry in a way that was fairly singular. I worried about whether and when that seed I'd planted, the idea of riding freights, along with several other ideas, might intersect with the curiosity of a growing boy. Of course, I wanted him to read that first book of mine, as well as the others that followed. And when he was 14 or 15, I gave him copies. But when he didn't immediately pick up Rolling Nowhere, let's just say I was fine with that. Then early last year, I saw him reading it. Uh-oh. "Great book, Dad," he said as I passed his bedroom. "Yeah? You liked it?" "Yeah, I liked it a lot." About a week later came the moment I'd been fearing. We may have been in the car. "You know your book, Dad?" "Yes." "Well, I wanted to ask, if I ever wanted to go on a trip like that, would you teach me what to do?" You mean how to ride the rails?" I already knew what he meant. "Yeah." Saying no, we both knew, would be hypocritical. So instead, I offered the compromise that had already been worked out by two sides of myself, the young man adventurer and the father adventurer who's a little more careful now. "Well, I would if we could go together." He didn't hesitate. "Sure." I'm just going to jump ahead here. We're in Cheyenne, Wyoming. We started in Denver. We caught a train I thought would go right over the Rockies, but I'd made a mistake. Instead, it went north. It didn't go over the Rockies. He didn't care. We ended up in Cheyenne. We used Google Maps to know when to get off a train, which is so cheating. But it saved us hours of walking, and we were hungry, and it was cold. And anyway, I was telling him how I'd been there 25 years before with a buddy of mine who now has like a kind of dementia and doesn't remember it at all. And the police followed us as we walked through town, the way they often follow you if you leave the area around the yards. Anyway, with Asa, we attracted no heat. The UP yard was unfenced, and we sat on an old piece of carpet at its edge, partially shaded by a scrubby tree. A guy in his 30s carrying a small pack walked by and paused. We'd seen a handful of other likely riders in Denver, but this was the first tramp we spoke to. Dressed in clean denim and a work shirt, he was just beginning his trip. He was sick of Cheyenne and going to try his luck in Casper, he said. The BNSF would get him there. Otherwise, fuck it, he'd go to Elko in Nevada on the UP. Just be careful on the BNSF north from Cheyenne, he warned. Trains pass through Warren Air Force Base, and MPs will arrest you if they see you. After he left, I commented to Asa that my goal in college had been precisely to get to know guys like that, no matter how borderline unhinged they might have seemed, and to travel with them if I could. There'd been more tramps back then, I added. By now we would have seen several occupied jungles or hobo camps on the edges of freight yards. As it was, we'd seen signs of occupation, such as cardboard that had been slept on and ashes from small cooking fires, but only a handful of travelers. "Are you interested in meeting the people around here?" I asked. "No," Asa replied. He'd met his share of dropouts over the years of riding the subway, he said. "I'm happy just riding with you." And in watching how I broke the law, he added, "because I know you as a very law-abiding individual. Honestly, when I read your stories, I'm surprised." "Really?" I asked. I told him I didn't think of myself that way. Frankly, I was more interested in not getting caught than in obeying the law. But on reflection, I could see how I'd given him a different impression. "I think it has to do with being a dad," I told him, at the same time wondering whether it had been so necessary to be that kind of a dad, the scout leader kind, as opposed to somebody more openly agnostic about rules. Trains started rolling in. There was plenty of traffic, but few places to ride. In the 20 years since my last hop, the rolling stock has changed. Almost all boxcars now have their doors closed and locked. Automobile carriers have doors on the end that prevent one from climbing up and entering the top floor, which the old design allowed. More and more freight trains are intermodal, meaning that their cargo is solely containers, offloaded directly from ships. The big metal boxes sit on special flat cars, most with nowhere to ride. And then I talk about a certain kind that's 48 feet long that you can ride. The last time I'd been in one in Spokane around 1990, my companion and I had been discovered by a railroad special agent who took down the info on our IDs and said he'd arrest us if he saw us again. I didn't tell Asa that. We walked a long way in the narrow canyons between trains, searching but not finding. We returned to the shade of our tree. There, the wait was short. Around 1 p.m., a mixed freight pulled in. 10 minutes later, we were climbing aboard another grainer. These are like cylinders on wheels with the ends beveled in a bit, and there's little platforms under that bevel. And you look for a platform on the rear side so you'll be out of the wind. And anyway, that's a good place to ride. Not that you should ride a freight train. Don't ride a freight train. Within half an hour, we were headed west. The first moments of a freight ride haven't changed for me at all. They're still like the beginning of a romance. Everything new, exciting, energized. A rush of new inputs, sights, sounds, smells. A brand new start. Where will it lead? We tried staying out of sight until we were well out of the yard, out of view of the tower. Then we took some pictures of each other and of ourselves together. And then outside Cheyenne, the train moving at a good clip, we sat back and made ourselves comfortable for a long ride. Late in the afternoon, the clouds hung heavy and dark. A few beams of light shot through for brief periods, a fabulous light show. But then the holes closed up and the clouds burst. We stuffed our gear into the opening in the grainer's frame and pressed ourselves in as far as we could go, succeeding in mostly staying dry. I'm glad we didn't find a flat car to ride on, I said. We'd be soaked. We stopped for a while, and Asa asked if he could climb on top of our car like they do in India. I asked him not to. The first time on the trip, I'd said a thing like that. For one, he'd be conspicuous to anybody who was looking. For another, stopped trains, as I've mentioned, can start with a jolt at any second, and I didn't want my son to topple 25 feet to the ground. The prospect of Asa getting injured had been haunting me the whole trip, and as we moved deeper into that long night, it grew. The view from our perch on the back of the grain car was of the shiny steel wheels of the car right behind us. Our platform had ladders at either corner, a horizontal bar at chest height that spanned its width, and a 4 or 5 inch lip that wrapped around the floor. That was it. Nothing else to stop a fall if the train took a sudden jerk and one of us lost our balance. I didn't know how I'd be able to live with myself if that should happen. It was a bit before midnight when the train stopped again, still not having arrived in Green River. We took the opportunity to finish the cheese, fruit, and crackers, and I told Asa the story of how I'd been in Green River years before by mistake. I'd arrived in Salt Lake City on the DNRGW, spent some days with tramps I'd met there, and decided to continue on my way north or west. I'd hopped on a freight train that had rumbled north to Ogden, and then, to my surprise and without stopping, headed east. I'd been stuck. Hours and hours it continued in the wrong direction, with me huddled in the rain beneath the axles of a trailer on a flatbed car. In October, until finally the train stopped. Asa said he remembered some of that from the book. Our train jerked forward, then back. Asa neatly grabbed a bar to steady himself, and I looked away. My anxiety over the possibility of him tumbling into the space between our car and the one behind had grown and grown, despite my efforts to tamp it down with reason. Finally, I told him, "It may not be logical, Ace, but I'm totally frightened that you're going to fall off the train." "Why? Do you think I'm being careless?" "No, not at all. In fact, I'm impressed by how quickly you've picked up how everything works. You paid attention to everything I've said, and you get it. You're brave, but you're not reckless. This was pretty much my highest compliment. His mother had tried preparing him for this concern of mine on the night before we began our journey. He's probably going to be really nervous, she said of me to Asa. He was with me, I know that. She had had to pass a train test before we got married. Now I explained how 99% of my previous riding had been by myself or with tramps and brought it with its scant need to watch out for others. So this is a new role for me because during our lives together, one of my main responsibilities has always been to keep you safe. And this is somewhat dangerous. So it's hard to shift gears. I'm having kind of a hard time with it. Seldom had I spoken so directly to my son about my own difficulties. So the paragraph I will not read because I can't is the one Rachel read, which I ask you to remember him putting his arm around me and me hoping the moment would never end. Thank you.